Welcome back to the Messy Reformation. My name's Jason Rice, and I'm the Associate Pastor at Bethel CRC and Chaplain at Central Wisconsin Christian in Waupun, Wisconsin. My co-host is Willie Cronky. He's a member at Pease CRC in Pease, Minnesota. We're just a couple of guys who love the Christian Reformed Church and want to see Reformation happen in our denomination. But we realize that whenever Reformation happens in the history of the church, things get messy. And after the last couple of synods, and as we move into this rebuilding phase of the Reformation, things continue to be messy in the Christian Reformed Church. So we're taking the opportunity to have conversations with pastors and leaders throughout the Christian Reformed Church to find out what's going on in our denomination, but also to talk about what Reformation and rebuilding might look like. If you haven't already, take a moment to click subscribe so you don't miss any of our upcoming content. We're dropping episodes every single Sunday evening. It's also important for you to know that you are our marketing plan. We rely on you to spread the word about what we're doing at the Messy Reformation. We rely on you to share our content, and we also rely on you to give us 5-star reviews and provide good feedback for this podcast. You can also support us financially on Patreon or Substack. All the money raised is used to build the platform of the Messy Reformation. With all that said, we're going to get to this week's episode, which is part 1 of our first ever roundtable discussion with Chris Ganski and Jared Michelson on the nature of the church. Well, we're starting something off new here at the Messy Reformation, something we're calling some roundtable discussions. We've kind of hinted at it over the last few episodes of the podcast that we're wanting to add another element to what we're doing rather than just interviewing local pastors, bringing on some local pastors, but also some professors at the seminary or various colleges to have some deeper theological reflection on the church. And so in particular, today we're going to be talking about Reformed Ecclesiology, or a doctrine of the church. And today we brought back on Chris Ganski, who was on the podcast a few weeks ago, and Jared Michelson, new professor at Calvin Theological Seminary. And so I'd give these guys each an opportunity to kind of introduce themselves a little bit, and then we'll dive into our conversation on Reformed Ecclesiology. But Chris, why don't you get us started, and then we'll jump over to Jared.
Yeah, well, it's great to be back with you guys, to be able to continue our conversation from a month or so ago about the nature of the church, and in a way, I'll be brief since I did introduce myself last time. My name is Chris Ganski. I'm pastor at City Reformed Church in Milwaukee. City Reformed Church started as a church plant in 2012. It started right after I'd finished my PhD in theology at Marquette University, and in part the kind of connection with our conversation today is, I wasn't writing directly on the nature of the church, but a lot of what I was working on in terms of Calvin's doctrine of the supper and the Holy Spirit kind of got me into the area of the nature of the church, and kind of one of the reasons I felt called to pastor a church, plant a church, rather than maybe seek an academic position, was just my, the sense of how important the church was, and had a lot of opinions about what the church should be like, that I would say, over the years, maybe somewhat arrogantly judging and being critical of the church. I said, well, hey, if I really believe this stuff, I should give my life to it. And so that was now over close to 15 years ago. And so I kind of coming at these questions, both as somebody who's been a pastor and a church planner for close to 15 years, but also somebody who's spent a fair amount of time reading pretty deeply in the area of ecclesiology.
Yeah, amen. Yeah, Jared, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so I will be starting at Calvin Seminary, teaching theology a year from now, and I'm currently finishing up a role at the University of St. Andrews as a research fellow. But as of just a year before that, I was a pastor as well in a Reformed denomination in Scotland, where I was ordained, called the United Free Church. And if you ever look at the list of Presbyterians in Scotland, there's a terrifying chart of all of the offshoots and branches and things like that. So I won't even try to explain which Presbyterian denomination I was, but a Scottish Presbyterian denomination. Maybe we could talk about that. I think all of those tendencies to divide actually has a lot to do with Reformed ecclesiology, interestingly. But anyways, so I guess similar to what Chris said, that church was a church that had been planted, that I was a part of almost from the beginning, and then took over as the lead minister a few years in. So went through different stages of actually being in a church plant as well. So while I'm now, more on the academic side, I really completely agree with what Chris was saying about basically if theology doesn't work in a church, if it doesn't make sense in real life, then something has gone horrifically wrong. And sadly, that is often the case in a lot of academic theology. It's not actually taking root in real lives. It's not giving people the resources to do funerals and care for people in the midst of tragedy and build congregations in secular settings. So while my job is in the university now, I'm still incredibly committed to thinking through what it means to do theology for the church and just being very involved in a church here. And I'll look very much forward to being involved in the CRC a year from now.
Yeah, amen. Yeah, we're excited to have you. I hear there's a lot of excitement about having you come.
Well, we'll see. That might get undermined with my rap, but yeah.
That's awesome. That's great. Well, I want to dive into right into our topic because there's a lot we could cover. Obviously, a 1 hour conversation on this is barely enough to scratch the surface. But to give just a little backstory, Chris and I are part of a pastor's group that he leads, and so we've had a lot of conversations in my time in Wisconsin. And one of the things that has come up over and over again is how we felt a need for the CRC to develop a more positive, biblical, reformed understanding of the church. And so that's really what led to our conference this last year being focused on Bavinck's Ecclesiology. And we just want to keep having some of those conversations. And so I want to start off asking the negative question, and we don't have to dwell there too long and I want to move more toward the positive vision of a reformed church. But what are some of those misunderstandings that you're seeing in the church today or in the Christian Reformed Church today about what it means to be a Reformed church, or even maybe let's just say a church in general?
Do you want me to go first, Chris, and then you jump in?
Yeah, I'm going to defer to you, Jared. Go ahead.
I'm going to defer to you. But one thing would be this. So in the Reformation, there's loads of images that are recovered, but there's this kind of duality that in the Reformation between viewing the church as the communion of saints and viewing the church as mother. And they want to preserve both. And one of them will seem like a more Roman Catholic image, and the other one will seem like a more Anabaptist image. And basically, I think that duality is kind of a tension that we're constantly drawn between. And a lot of our churches today go towards that communion of saints idea. So what the church is the communion of people that have been redeemed and are trusting in Christ. What that gets profoundly right is that we do have an immediate relationship to God via Jesus Christ. There's something incredibly central about that image, that we're not dependent upon a hierarchy in order to have a relationship with God. However, when that side of the picture is emphasized at the expense of Christ as mother, we miss the fact that the way in which we meet Christ is actually through a historic community that has been produced by the grace of God. That we are, Calvin is very robust in speaking about this. We are actually brought to birth through men and women that have been following Christ through the ages. We're standing in a tradition, that language of the New Testament, something that has been handed down. So I tend to think, particularly in our Western context today, maybe this is me speaking too anecdotally from my own experience, we tend to think that the church just exists to help us in our private relationship with God. That basically what really matters is me knowing how to pray better, how to be more faithful to Jesus, how to live a Christian life, and the church delivers me religious goods and services to make me a better Christian. That basically means what really matters is my private relationship, and the church is just contributing to that. And that basically has only gotten one side of the picture, where there's at least as much a priority on us corporately as the body of Christ. So that would maybe be one way to start the conversation. What do you think, Chris?
Yeah, let me just add on, and then so I was rereading the Heidelberg Catechism questions 54 and 55, I think it is, on the community. What does it mean to confess the church as one holy Catholic church? One Holy Catholic Church, just Holy Catholic Church, and then the communion of saints. But what struck me, and this kind of connects with what you're saying, Jared, how I would put it is part of the Reformed vision of the church is that this is how we live out our union with Christ in a public way. And I think you're right that we tend to think of the church as just like how it services our individual needs, our individual piety, rather than being a kind of manifestation of our union with Christ understood publicly. And I would say the second question in particular about the communion of saints kind of hits on that, where it's like the gifts that we receive from Christ. But I would say that the other, I'll shift the frame a little bit, going back to Jason, your question about some of the challenges. One of the ways I would put it, and I think it's a pretty comprehensive way of thinking, is the distinction between the church as functional and ontological. And I would say probably, if I were to say what is the sort of root problem with a lot of ecclesiologies today and just kind of our instinctual ways of thinking about the church, is that we instinctually think about the church in almost purely functionalist categories without a sense of the church's ontology, by which I mean, what is its being and nature? Because the function of the church needs to flow from the being of the church. And I think that we have unclarity about what the church is, its being. And so, of course, then we cast about looking for what works, function. And so I think part of the importance of ecclesiology is regrounding us in the nature of the church and its being, right? And so that's where you get all these metaphors in the scriptures for the nature of the church, whether it's the church as the body or the temple or the people of God or a field. There's an ontology there. And so that's how I would put it. And I would say there's a lot of different manifestations of that.
Yeah. Where do you guys think, how did we start to lose that ontology or that fundamental understanding? We've talked about it quite a bit, where we've been in many churches who've really, we just heard over and over when we ask, why are we doing this? And they say, well, because it works or whatever, right? Yeah. In one sense or the other. And so this kind of pragmatic approach, right? Or like you said, a functional approach. But it wasn't always that way, right? There was kind of this, here's who we are, and then the pragmatic would flow from that ontological part. At what point did you see that kind of making a shift in the church?
Real quick, I would just say there's two. I mean, it's a complex question, right? I do actually think the seeds of it are in the Reformation itself. And this is something I do think that the shift in Reformation ecclesiologies from the attributes of the church as one holy Catholic apostolic church to the marks of the church, which is, the prayer preaching of the word, the right administration of the sacraments, and discipline, depending on where that wasn't always a mark for everybody. But those are, if you think about it, they are kind of functional marks, right? Because the question in the Reformation for the reformers was like, well, how do you find a true church? How do you distinguish between the church as it exists and a gospel-centered church? And these were kind of they're functional, and so like they had an ontology of the church that so in its proper context, that was, though this isn't an argument against or the Reformation or these marks as really important, but you can kind of see how when you get deeper into modernity and we tend to lose our touch with deep ontologies or thinking deeply about the nature of things, and we're thinking more about their purpose or function or how we can use them. So in some ways, the functionalism, the way we approach church, is just part of being modern, right? That we think of institutions as human constructs, as things that are completely historical, and for us to build and deconstruct and rebuild, and so it's part of that whole thing that we all exist in. So that would be one way. I don't know, Jared, do you have thoughts on?
Yeah, I think that's I mean, we're getting really deep here, aren't we? There is a kind of in early modernity. I would definitely not blame the Reformation for this, but in early modernity, not that you were, but there is this sense that the world is like a machine. And so whereas before the world is something that is constantly interacting with God, that if God was not basically breathing life into the world at every moment, it would cease to exist. There becomes more what we now think of as deist images. So you think of David Hume literally said the world is like a giant machine. And if you believe in God, you think there's a watchmaker. And Christians, rather than saying, actually, the world's not a machine, they said, you're absolutely right. And William Paley said, the world's like a watch, but a watch needs a designer. And so actually, even the way Christians were thinking about the world was buying into this idea that the world can kind of operate on its own steam. And we just need God to either start things at the beginning or sometimes to break into basically a secular world where God is inactive and to do a miracle, to break through the natural processes. So the big difference is, do you think basically the world can run on its own unless God is breaking in? Or do you think the world on its own, in all of its naturalness, is wholly dependent upon God in every moment? And that's kind of the classical Christian view. And so how does this relate to this idea of functionalism? That I basically think many of us have an idea of the church, that the church basically operates on our own steam, that maybe we need God to elect us and save us. But after that, we're now wholly natural again. And now it's up to us to communicate the gospel really well, to create really excellent services, to do all of the things that will allow the church to flourish, rather than, to Chris's point about ontology. One of the key images, again, from the Reformation is the church is a creature of the word. It is being produced by the life-giving work of Christ mediated to us by the Spirit. So yeah, I think this deep pragmatism, which we see in contemporary evangelicalism, is actually the product of a deep spiritual malformation, where we're increasingly thinking of the world as separate from God.
Well, that's really helpful. That's really, really helpful. I mean, I've always pointed back, probably not far enough, right? I've pointed back to more of the church growth movement and the church as a business, and with the marketing campaigns. And if we do all of these things and do these 10 steps, you can build the church. And on a shallow sense, people looked and saw these churches and they say, wow, look at, they're booming, they're exploding. We can build the church. And so it's this functional thing. But I think you're right. It's way deeper than just that. That itself grew out of this idea that, we're the ones doing this in our own steam because God's not fully active and involved in every aspect of it. Yeah.
And I think obviously, and Chris, please jump in and correct me after this, but when we're thinking about something like the church growth movement, I certainly wouldn't want to say that human activity has no bearing on the health of a church. God, we are movers. We participate with God. The way in which God is building, is at work in the world in cooperation with us. Nonetheless, there is, not only in the church growth movement, but in church planting movements, including church planting movements that are very popular in reform circles, there is a pragmatism which says, this is the way to do church planting. This is the way. If you preach the Bible, people will come. If you do this kind of preaching, people will come. If you build this kind of church, people will come. And the thing I always want to say to that, having been in Scotland so long, is to say, do you think Scottish people are just way more sinful than Americans? The biggest church in my county is 250 people, and that's a massive church for Scotland. Basically, we're in much of Western Europe, you're facing deep-seated forms of secularization that are not going to be solved by any method, whether it's a church growth method, or whether it's a charismatic method, or whether it's a expository preaching method. And so that's not to say those things don't matter. But I do think that this pragmatism it doesn't really work on the ground. But yeah, what do you think, Chris?
Yeah, so many thoughts here. I do, and we're pivoting a little bit in one of our questions here to the question of what does it mean to be the church world, or in a world that's secularizing? Mm-hmm. And I do think, I love that you brought in your context. I wanted to ask a question about that. Being in Europe, because I lived in Germany for a year and lived and worshipped with the Pietist Lutherans down in Tübingen, and it's just so different there. And this was 20 years ago, in terms of how they think about the church and the assumptions and I would say that Germany in 2005 then was still more secular than Milwaukee in 2025, in terms of how deeply, pervasively different assumptions are broadly within the culture, such that I think a lot of church growth movement kind of philosophy and thinking is just an offshoot, a modern offshoot of revivalism. And I think, I think Tim Keller was always right to say, listen, a lot of revivalism is just basically kind of reminding people who were steeped in Christian culture and context of things they already knew were true and convincing them. And so you can have these revivals, you know, almost always happen in Christendom contexts.
Absolutely.
Right? You don't have them on the frontiers, right? Where you have no Christian framework, no Christian language. The Bible, God, Christ, all that is completely new. And I think what you see in Europe and a lot of the kind of highly secularized parts of the United States is like there is no grammar. And so conversion and new growth takes way, way, way longer. And so a lot of the pragmatism, which is exhausting itself now as secularization speeds up and corrodes all of the sort of late, you know, what's left of Christendom in America, which there's still a lot of, it becomes less and less useful and helpful, which means you then have to go back to, well, what are the core things? You know, what does it mean to be a church? And then this is why I think the early church is such a great example to go back to, because you know, the early church is basically bringing the gospel in context in which there is no framework, pre-given framework, except for the Jewish people that were scattered about, which Paul made a lot of use of. And so, again, there's a lot of model there. And so I find, at least when it comes to ecclesiology and mission, I think I'm drawn more to the early church traditions and their experiences in the Reformation because the context is very different.
Yeah.
So when we think about, right, we think about the confessional moment that we're in as the CRC, the confessions and just dwelling so much on that as a framework, as our content, we're asking it to serve purposes and serve people that are already in then, right? When to look at the church in a secularizing world, you have to prove the confessions before you can just accept them. Is that a fair way of thinking about it?
I would say yes, not prove obviously in this kind of like, let me just prove on a neutral standpoint why Heidelberg is the most accurate representation of the nature of reality. If you can do that, that's amazing. Great. I'd love to hear that.
I'll let you do that at Calvin.
I think we have to do that with the people in our church. The most effective thing you can. By the way, so to go back to what you're both saying, I love what Chris said. The two biggest, most celebrated revivals in the UK in the last century were the Welsh revival and was called the Lewis revival, which was in the islands of Lewis in Scotland, which were historically the two most deeply Christian and Reformed bits of the UK. They were not these, branching out into secular context. They were a revival of people that still had a deep Christian heritage. So I'm all for revival. I think revival is fantastic. I don't think it's the solution to secularization. And so to your point, it's not only presenting the confessions in a way that is winsome, that is coherent, that kind of it gives an answer to the deep existential questions of life for outsiders. It's for our own kids. Our kids will not be in this church if you're not explaining how the Reformed faith is true, is plausible, and makes existential sense in our world. And so actually, I think having a less pragmatic approach, again, it doesn't mean we have nothing to do. It means you don't buy the lie that if I found the right method, I would see exponential growth. And you say, do you know what? Maybe the most effective thing I could do is really catechize my children well and really love my neighbors and show them through being embedded in this community what this faith looks like in real life. Maybe those small things are actually what's really missionally effective, not all of the strategies and things like that.
Yeah. I remember after reading Truman's book, Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, at the end, he said, really, instead of studying the Reformation and how the church functioned in a secular world during that point, we should go back to the first and second centuries and really understand how the church engaged with the world in that. And so I've since then, I've read a lot of books on that, wanting to get my brain into that. And it's so simple. I remember I just talked to my church about this recently and said, one of the primary ways their primary evangelistic strategy was to have people over for a meal.
Yeah. exactly.
They would have people over for a meal, and as you ate food and talked, you could bring up your faith and talk to them about who Jesus was, what he's done in your life. Like that was one of the or in the different bathhouses and whatever in this, they were just active out in the community and were talking to people and sharing their faith. There was no crazy strategy. There wasn't a big plan. They were just living their faith out in the world. It's very simple, actually. And God,
and I could ramble on this. But that will become more effective the more secular our world becomes. There's an elder at our church here is from a working class, really rough background. And he told me he had basically never been round for a family meal at someone else's house. He met people at the pub. He met people out. He was a very social guy. But the idea of coming around with a family meal where the kids were there was completely foreign. And it had a really amazing effect on him. Now, that might sound really strange, but I think in an increasing secular culture, that will be more and more abnormal to be having a hospitable family table and will be more evangelistically important.
Yeah. Could I jump in here? There's so many conversation threads I want to. Yeah, I think that one of the things that you see in the early church is, in some ways, you could describe their strategy, if there is one, is one of humanization, right? Understood in the best sense. And when you look at like the like just the dignity that say slaves or women had in the community.
Absolutely.
Elevated. No, this was unthinkable in the Greco-Roman world. And Christianity thrived amongst the marginal populations and the rich. And they were both together. And things that we take for granted as Western, modern Enlightenment, post-Enlightenment people as just like, well, this is what it means to be human and everybody has rights. Well, these are unthinkable things in the first century. And Christianity brought this vision of the human. And in many ways, I think that we are, that's going to be the same, like just like the story you shared, Jared, about having a meal around a family. It's going to be all those kinds of things that I think are the future of the mission of the church, not gimmicks or strategies or advertising campaigns, but humanization. Here's what it means. So this is what true human flourishing looks like. And it's pretty ordinary and basic and unsexy, but it's where wisdom and goodness is. But I want to go back to the question that Dan raised about the role that the confessions have. And let me pivot back. I mean, I've said a couple things that make it seem as if the reform, maybe the reformed confessions or the Reformation isn't a resource for thinking about the church, but to
We've
the
all
contrary.
been very concerned by these concepts.
Yeah, I know. I got to balance it out now. Two thoughts. One, I think one of the marks of Reformation ecclesiologies is just the centrality of the word. Like Jared had said, the creature is a church the church is a creature of the word, and that there's it's just the activity of the church articulating its faith in time and space is central to its being and its continued existence. And actually, Kevin Rowe, who is a New Testament scholar at Duke, has a fabulous book on Acts, The World Upside Down, I think is what it's called. But in a different, he has such a keen insight into the book of Acts, but he describes as one of the essential features of flourishing faith in the early church is what he calls articulacy of belief, is that they again and again are just articulated what they believe, right? So they're devoted to the apostles' teaching. And it's that activity of articulating what we believe that I think is so central and what we understand to be what it means to be confessional. So that's such that the activity of catechizing and preaching and discipling people in the gospel, in the faith, is part of what gives the church its continued purpose in the world. So that would just connect that. I just think that the gospel is at the heart, right? And so one of the ways that ecclesiology shifts in the Reformation, for the Roman Catholic tradition, and it's still true today, the word of God in many ways is preceded by the church. The canon, as the Catholics would argue rightly, comes into existence like after the church, right? And so they would say the church precedes the word. Now, I don't want to argue with how, the Reformation flips it, but the reformers do flip it. And they say, no, the gospel comes first and then the church from the gospel. such that the church is a consequence of the gospel. And so that the church then is always accountable to the gospel, understood very broadly, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's really important when we think about how the confessions relate and the content of faith relates to faith. But if I could then, one last little thing here. When you look at the Reformation ecclesiologies broadly, and here's where I just think the missional character of our moment and the Reformed tradition in particular is just a great resource. You do not, because the Reformed Reformation is so different from the Lutheran Reformation and from the, what becomes the Anglican tradition, because the Reformed never had social politically stable contexts in which to sort of do their work for the most part. The Lutherans, they had, Luther had a pretty positive benefactor in Frederick the Wise. And the Church of England, right, it flips back and forth. But for the most part, when it's Protestant, it has a king, a queen behind it. But for the Reformed, Calvin, you have these cities, these cantons where you can be Reformed, but you have all these refugees, Reformed refugees, the Netherlands, France, Hungary, Poland, some going to England and back to Scotland. And so you have this diaspora, which is why the Reformed tradition is more international from the get-go than the Lutheran Reformation. The Lutheran Reformation migrates up into Scandinavia. It still has kings that are supportive of it. But what you get, though, is you have more reflection in confessional documents on the nature of the church. And you have more confessions, in part because they don't have like a monarch to defend true faith, even though they're looking for it, right? Calvin wants it, the writer, but even you think of the Belgic Confession. I mean, obviously we know what happened to Guido de Bries, but so there is a way that I think in our moment we actually have like the way the Reformed confessions talk about the church almost like sets the table, because it doesn't assume the establishment of church and state or church and culture, if that makes sense. And so I do think we have a lot of research. I know I said a lot there, but I'll stop.
Mm-hmm. You have any follow-up on that, Jared?
Yeah, I think to kind of pick up on some of those themes, but step back to a wider perspective, like a bit more widely. I do think part of the genius of Reformed ecclesiology, if we're just kind of hitting our chests here and kind of grunting at how proud we are of ourselves. Look, every tradition has a lot to learn from other traditions. Reformed people have a lot to learn from other traditions. We could talk about all of the. One of the failures of Reformed ecclesiology is we divide all the time, and that is a scandal. But we could talk about that later if we want. On the one hand, you have a kind of folk church. Okay, a folk church is a church that is just the church of the nation. And you still hear this from a lot of Anglicans today. You don't need to join the Anglican church if you get in the Church of England. If you get married, if you baptize your kids and never show up, this is a church for the nations. You don't need to be members in a formal sense. Now, I'm uncomfortable with that. That allows the church to kind of be the chaplain to the nation without having the kind of prophetic, distinctive voice which calls out the nation. And we can talk about how that can go radically wrong, but even now, there's always a temptation to soften the church's witness in order to maintain that national pastoral role. On the other hand, and what I think we're a lot more tempted to today is again, I'm using Anabaptist because I don't want to assume that Baptist churches are the same as this today. There's a lot of diversity in different Baptist churches, but that says there is an incredibly rigid distinction between the church and the world. And historically, the Reformed tradition were actually somewhere in between that. They were not just a folk church. There was membership. And yet there was, we might even say, to put it somewhat provocatively, sometimes at least, a more flexible approach to membership. And so I think calling people to this higher vision of what it means to be a Christian and how you fully live that out, but also having a porous community, having ways that people can enter into the community without fully embracing this way of life is potentially, again, a missional resource which Reformed Christians have. We're not totally set off against the world. Again, Neo-Calvinism was really good on this, like having a positive vision of the church as impacting the world beyond just what's happening on a Sunday. Sometimes they would use the the kind of distinction between the church as organism and as institution to get at that. And that distinction can be used well or poorly, but it's making a really important point that the church is actually embedded within a society, that it's not totally separate, that we can't pretend that if, for example, if we're a church in whatever country, but let's say America or, the United States or Canada, that we're not deeply impacted for good and for ill by our society. We are not just a separate culture. We are a outpost of the kingdom within this culture. And so that duality that the Reformed tradition gives, I think is really helpful for thinking missionally about how do we stand out from the culture, but also recognize that inevitably we're impacted by this culture, and can we embrace that by having this kind of porous approach that allows people to be included in our communities before they fully get it, so to speak.
That's all we have for this week. If you want to help us out and support the Messy Reformation, another thing you can do is sign up for our newsletter through Substack. That way you'll get episodes and summaries sent directly into your email inbox. It also gives us the ability to communicate with our audience, which is one of the biggest struggles of a podcast. So head over to the Messy Reformation on Substack and sign up for our newsletter. But until then, don't forget this is Christ's church, and he bought it with his blood. And we've been warned that wolves will come in trying to destroy the flock. So keep a close watch on your life and on your doctrine. Preach the word in season and out of season, and keep fighting the good fight in this messy Reformation.